We are going to have a number of things we want to talk to you about. The first one is, first of all, thank you, Rabbi Dr. Weiss, for a very informative lecture, and as well Dr. Furman. There are going to be some changes in our schedule, which you will find out about momentarily, but first, we're going to divide this into the following. Our two speakers will, if they have any questions of each other, we will pursue that, after which we will go back to those questions that were asked to Dr. Furman prior to Rabbi Dr. Weiss's address, and then we'll take general questions from the audience. Doctors Weiss and Furman, are there any questions you have of each other on any of these things that we talked about? If not,
yes. Well, one question, because Dr. Furman alluded to it in a presentation, and I think you alluded to a bias, which I would tend to agree with. The present Bush administration has been fairly machmir, fairly severe or restrictive in its use and development of stem cell research, only allowing lines that have already been developed, and very limited in its use and scope. And that seems to be the way things are going to continue, as long as certainly the Bush administration is in power. And from my own readings, I get a clear sense that the scientific and medical world, not unanimously, but overall, would like to veer in a different direction. And do you have any information or any thoughts on that conflict and what its resolution might or might develop into?
I feel like I should have a disclaimer. These are only my views. Personally, I think given the political realities, Bush did, I guess, the most liberal policy that he possibly could without alienating the Christian right. Having said that, I believe most scientists would like to see future stem cells derived, stem cell lines. Excuse me. There are many limitations to the current available stem cells. There will be developments that we can't even predict at this point, and we don't know if we have enough, or scientists don't know if there's enough. And then the question is, you have all these embryos that are destined to be destroyed, whether it's just by thawing them or putting them to good use. I can't, it's, again, I guess the most liberal policy that George Bush could have.
I have a question for Rabbi Dr. Weiss. You brought the Gemara about Me'emasai nichnas and neshama la'odam. When does the soul go in? Mishas Pekida, from the time of conception, or Mishas Yetzira, the time of the formation of the fetus. I was distracted for a few moments in my responsibilities as chairman, and I don't know if you brought the Rambam, I believe in Hilchos Rotzeach, that if the fetus is a danger to the mother, then you can take it apart piece by piece inside the mother. But once it presents the head, kivin sheyotza rosho, Rambam says, as you certainly know, ein dochen nefesh mipnei nefesh. You can't destroy one nefesh before the other. And there are those commentaries that say that the implication from this Rambam is that before the child presents the head, that it's not called nefesh, it's not called soul. And assuming that nefesh and neshama are terms which are used interchangeably, what do you do with this Rambam that would it seem to imply that there is no calling of a child a nefesh, a life force, before it presents the head?
Okay, first of all, that passage, I did not quote that passage in Maimonides, but it's good that you bring it up in terms of the issue of abortion in general. That passage in the Rambam in Maimonides is used actually by those, including Rabbi Feinstein, to indicate the severity of abortion in general. Because Maimonides, in the statement that you referred to, gives an explanation that is not explicit, at least in the Talmud, or not as clear as the Maimonides himself expresses it, and that is he uses the concept of rodef. That is to say that in utero, if the pregnancy is in jeopardy, which is also causing hazard or potential fatality to the mother, that the embryo or fetus is considered to be a pursuer, somebody who is pursuing or chasing another person, as it were, metaphorically, as if I was chasing someone with a gun trying to kill them. And the law is that if anyone is chasing another person to kill them, the rodef, the pursuer, is susceptible to anyone interfering and stopping that pursuer in whatever means. Details about what means are or not, but certainly if the means are required to kill the pursuer, one is obligated to do so to save the pursuant, to save the potential victim. By virtue of that argument, Maimonides left himself open to the analysis by many that he feels that in general abortion is akin on some level to murder, and only permitted because of the fact that I'm permitted to murder someone else who is about to murder someone else, so that we consider the fetus as if the fetus is about to murder its mother, and therefore I'm allowed to interfere. That Rambam is a discussion of tremendous analyses regarding its implications. You're right that clearly even the Rambam concedes that there's a certain level of life that it attains at birth that it didn't have beforehand, because obviously it continues to pursue once it begins to deliver and once the head begins to crown. Nonetheless, the Rambam considers that to be a full nefesh, and I can't kill one to save the other, but his implication is that beforehand it's also considered to be a murder on perhaps a lower level. That is the way many interpret that Rambam. The term nefesh, in general, from the medieval commentators, seems to be not synonymous with neshama. Nefesh seems to be more of a physical life, as Rashi points out, nefesh, yitziras ha-nefesh, the formation of the living soul with the delineation of various body parts, and that nefesh seems to be one of physical being, neshama seems to be the one of spiritual, and that's the discussion that is never connected in terms of the rabbinic authorities. So that Rambam seems to serve as a source for the severity, understanding, though, that there is still a difference between murder in utero and murder later, and it's clearly less severe, even according to the Rambam.
Thank you. Rabbi Dr. Ackerman?
Again, I was also distracted a little bit in my responsibilities here, and I don't know if you mentioned it, but because you brought up the president's ruling in stem cell research, in your analysis of the Jewish poskim decisors, what would have been the Jewish recommendation or the Jewish ruling had President Bush ruled according to Jewish halacha?
I think the overwhelming majority, which would I think include Rabbi Tendler, for example, as well as the Rabbinical Council of America and others as well, I get the feeling, though Dr. Steinberg can probably answer that more specifically, that the rabbinic opinions in Israel are also inclined to permit stem cell research on these excess in vitro clinic fertilized eggs. Rabbi Bleich, in his recent article, is inclined but is not yet willing to permit it. He leaves, from my reading of his article, he leaves the issue not completely resolved, and he isn't completely comfortable permitting it. He's inclined to, but he's not completely comfortable doing so. And at least one of the issues which has not been clarified for me is the issue that Rabbi Vajner points out, the issue of the wasting of the seed, not so much the issue of abortion perhaps, but the consensus seems to be that the Jewish perspective would be, and in fact that's I think the opinion of non-Orthodox rabbinic opinions as well, conservative, and I think that's the gist of Orthodox rabbinic opinions, to allow and to promote stem cell research. To go as far as the Rabbinical Council did to say that it's an obligation is a separate issue. Whether once something is permissible, whether this is the way to go by obligation is a separate issue. But I think the gist is, and the general consensus is to permit, certainly not unanimously though.
I would gather if they use the word obligation, meaning because they feel it has tremendous import for eventual saving of life.
Yes.
But correct me if I'm wrong, I would suspect when you talk about these decisors being inclined but not saying outright to do it, because they are afraid that once they say it's permissible, the medical establishment, as they've done many times in the past, will then go ahead and do and use stem cells that would not have been permissible to use. In other words, they'll extend the ruling even further on their own, so the rabbis are afraid to be too permissible because the medical establishment will then extend it further.
Rabbi Bleich makes a similar argument at the end of his article. He points out that this phenomenon that you find within the Christian world, such preoccupation with stem cell research and a general tendency towards prohibiting stem cell research, he thinks is perhaps something divinely orchestrated to emphasize to us the significance of the value of human fetal life, and that they're the ones who are teaching the world the significance of fetal human life, even if in this case their application may not be consistent with Jewish law, but they're impressing upon us the significance of that level of human life, and that's their function in this particular campaign, and it's not something to be belittled. Whether or not we agree, practically speaking, but perhaps that's their function and they're kind of doing that work, which may then allow us to be more lenient because we know that there's a kind of balance at the other end.
Before we get to our audience, I just have one more question for you, Rabbi Dr. Weiss. You brought the pasuk Shofech Dama Odom Ba'odom Dama Yishofech and the limud Shofech Dama Odom Ba'odom. It's clear that you realize that you left out one, I'm sure deliberately, one of the limudim that we have from them and one of the exclusions. Should I bring it up or should you bring it up? Well, as you well know, the Sheva Mrs. B'nai Noach, that there is a difference, a little ticklish issue, but there's a difference between whether a Jew performs an abortion or a non-Jew performs an abortion. I believe the Gemara learns out from that Shofech Dama Odom Ba'odom, meaning a man and a man, is only applies to a Ben Noach, but non-Jew, but a Jewish doctor may not have that particular ban of performing an abortion, as I recall the halacha.
You're right that the Talmud never explicitly makes the correlation from Ben Noach to Yisrael. The Talmud talks about the fact that the non-Jewish world, one of their Noachide laws includes abortion, presumably under the category of murder, and doesn't explicitly connect that phrase to Jews. However, the medieval commentators, Tosfos in the Tractate in Sanhedrin, points out that there's no need to connect that specific source to Jews, because there's a basic principle that there can be nothing for a non-Jew that is prohibited to do that a Jew is permitted to do. Leika midam, there's nothing that a non-Jew is prohibited from doing that a Jew is permitted to do. And therefore, says Tosfos, clearly if a non-Jew is prohibited from performing an abortion, Jews, and that's the 95% consensus of the medieval commentators, leaving out a few minority opinions that don't make that extrapolation, that a Jew, just like non-Jew, is prohibited from performing an abortion, presumably based on the same verse, which applies universally. It doesn't apply exclusively to non-Jews. No verse applies exclusively to non-Jews. It only incorporates non-Jews and extends to Jews as well. One of the questions is, in terms of severity, there is an opinion both in Tosfos and in the Catholic Church, that non-Jews have the prohibition of abortion even in situations where the mother's life is in danger. And the other opinion in Tosfos is that that's not so, that a non-Jew is, just like a Jew, permitted to perform an abortion to save the mother's life. That's a point of discussion. Rabbi Feinstein, in his discussions, based on letters by Rav Unterman, the late chief rabbi, discusses the possibility that abortion for a Jew may even be more severe, that maybe during the first 40 days, as we referenced before, a Jew is not permitted to perform an abortion, he suggests, but a non-Jew may be permitted, and therefore there's a discussion about one of the Rishonim, one of the early medieval commentators, I think the Ramban, performing an abortion. And they talk about that it was done within the first 40 days for a non-Jew. There's a question whether that really did happen or wasn't happening, whether it was a mistake in terms of the text and it never happened. But if it ever did happen, says Reb Moshe, it was talking about a Jew performing an abortion for a non-Jew within the first 40 days. But otherwise, Jew and non-Jew are pretty much alike. That's Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu makes that statement, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. All these issues of stem cell are similar for Jew and non-Jew.
Right now, we want to get back to those questions. Should we go to these or get back to the questions that were asked to Dr. Furman? General questions. Yes, yes. We'll wait for a mic to be brought to you. Please identify yourself.
My question is to Rabbi Weiss. You talk about embryos that are designated for implantation. We know that when ova are harvested, that most of them are designated for implantation. At what point, whether it's one pregnancy or another, at what point, halachically, are you permissible to say that these frozen embryos are no longer available for implantation and make them available for stem cell research?
Well, actually, maybe Dr. Furman should answer the first half of that question because, if you'd like to, that is, the technology, as far as I'm aware of, which I'm not anywhere near being a reproductive endocrinologist, the closest I got to it was corroborating with Dr. Grazi. But nonetheless, the technology, when it first selects the fertilized eggs to be implanted, it looks at a number of qualitative characteristics, determining which ones they feel have the best opportunity for implantation and successful pregnancy. So they choose those and they implant those, and the others they don't. Some of those may never be used because of their characteristics, or some may be put in liquid nitrogen for purposes of subsequent implantation. But I think from what the rabbinic decisors are expressing, it's that initial selection that determines, not the fact that they may use it at some other time, depending if needed for this couple again in another cycle or for another couple, but that the initial selection of those 3, 4, 5, or 6, however many they plan to implant within the uterus, are selected now. And the others that are not selected now are the ones that they're talking about to be discarded, I believe it. Dr. Furman perhaps can talk to the technology a little bit more.
I actually know a few numbers for you. For in vitro fertilization, the success rate for pregnancy and for subsequent birth is 1 in 5. So they generally implant 5 embryos. However, with superovulation and the associated technologies, they can sometimes harvest 20 or 30 eggs to be fertilized. I don't have the numbers for how many eggs develop after fertilization, but they do implant a number, they do save them for subsequent pregnancies.
In vitro, that all the other frozen embryos can be designated for stem cell research. I mean, what right do we have to say that? The eggs really belong to the mother, and halakhically you're saying that can, that...
In fact, they cannot be designated. It is up to the people whose embryos they are.
Right, they have to
them.
give informed consent.
Yes.
You're saying to have them used one way or the other.
Just to add, that's true. You need to require the consent, as Dr. Furman pointed out. And there are other discussions in other articles regarding proprietorship. That was one of the issues in the Nachmani case that we referred to earlier, in terms of who is the proprietor of these eggs, and therefore, from a halakha viewpoint, who has the right to make decisions. The way it's practiced now, it requires consent. Whether halakhically that is a subject of other articles related to this particular point.
All right. Yes, back there. Would you identify yourself?
Hi, my name is Dr. Allen. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I have 2 questions for Rabbi Weiss. The first question is, you talked, first of all, there's this idea of harvesting 20 embryos, implanting 5. That gets very complicated when we talk about it in a halachic case. In fact, some of the discussions about whether in vitro fertilization is permissible or not really depend on how you proceed with how many embryos you select and then what happens to those embryos. And so what you may have occurring, correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi Weiss, is that most of what would be acceptable to be used halakhically for stem cell research would be from couples or from people who did not follow halakha initially in order to obtain these embryos. So for example, from non-Jews or from people who were either Jewish but did not concern themselves with halakha at the time when they were donating these embryos, and then at that point halakha could step in and say, well, we could then use these embryos. Because otherwise, I think the problem is, as the woman in front mentioned, is that I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong again, but that the embryos have to be very carefully designated for use for reproduction when it's halakhically obtained through IVF for those people who do permit IVF. That's one question. The second question is to speak to the thing that you talked about hashkas zera. I think that's a very serious issue, and in terms of the post-scheme, and that even for research, it's not clear that at least that I've seen, that anyone is permitted using overriding the prohibition of hashkas zera for issues of research. The only area where it's permitted is for issues of reproduction, and this would be solely for research. In fact, even to strengthen that, there's a famous case of a boy who was going to undergo radiation for testicular neoplasm that had asked, I believe it's Kashe Doron, about whether he could prematurely bank sperm for later use, and was told that that was prohibited because it wasn't right in front of him. It wasn't right for the here and now. So I think for research, I'm not sure that anyone's really said that that prohibition is not in vogue for hashkas zera, and also speak to the question about the use of embryos from people who went through the procurement in sort of a different method than what we would do according to halacha.
Wow. Regarding the first issue, again, maybe Dr. Furman can clarify for us, but to the best of my knowledge, which may be inaccurate in this context, an Orthodox couple who are going to proceed with in vitro fertilization don't fundamentally proceed differently than non-Jewish or non-Orthodox couples. One of the issues that they address is the procurement of sperm, how that's accomplished, and there's hierarchies. In Dr. Grazi's book, there's a very good article by Dr. Yoel Jacobowitz, Rabbi Jacobowitz's son from Baltimore, who goes through the various hierarchies of how to procure sperm, and that there are differences in opinions. Rabbi Moshe has a more severe limiting, others have more allowances. So the basic approach is that if you permit in vitro fertilization, where one of the first issues is issues of procuring the sperm, how does one do so? But once one goes ahead with that, whichever method one's going to use, whether it's going to be using a condom in the context of sexuality, whether it's going to be using other methods, once one gets past that point, then the issues become you're going to harvest similarly and fertilize, except the major difference will be that in a couple that is perhaps not Orthodox or not Jewish, they may harvest and implant up to 5 or 6, and a Jewish couple may harvest and implant, let's say, 3, to avoid the potential complications of multiple gestation or multiple pregnancy, which comes into issues which may or may not be problematic, addressed in different contexts of fetal reduction. So that's one of the major differences. But the points, those are specific issues that come up in the process of assisted reproductive technology for Jewish patients. Sperm procurement, how many to fertilize or how many to actually implant. Not so much in how many oocytes to retrieve, to the best of my knowledge, and not so much how many to fertilize, because you'll fertilize a number and choose the 3 best and then plant that. Now, it's a good question. Maybe Dr. Grazi does it differently. Maybe the others do it differently, and they don't do it. But presumably, it would make sense both medically and it would make sense halachically that if you're going to go ahead with in vitro fertilization to optimize the chances, that's the justification for procuring the sperm, that you're doing it for reproductive purposes. So it would seem, from just a glance, that it would make sense to optimize that possibility with limiting significant complications. So you try to fertilize the number that will give you the best possible 3 best and implant those. So whatever is excess, and the general consensus is that that's not of major significance, leaving out the issue of hashkas zera, which again Rav Wajner, at least from my readings, doesn't resolve. You have, yes.
The issue, first of all, the issue they say about fertilized embryos. I mean, I don't see Rabbi Breyowitz. I don't know if he's here yet, but he has an article that discusses this about whether or not that potential life, once it's fertilized, is allowed to be destroyed for that issue. That not forget about the procurement of sperm. That's another issue altogether. But once you fertilize an embryo, for sure the egg is not a problem, I think. But once you fertilize the embryo, then it has a potentiality of life, as you were mentioning, even though it hasn't been implanted. And I think that remains somewhat unclear. The second issue is about hashkas zera, whether or not that's a problem, in terms of getting rid of
so that
research.
yeah, that I didn't resolve. Okay, I didn't answer your second question, did I? So you can privately.
I just want to say one thing before we close this session. We've been witness to many deep technological concepts, arguments, and ideas, but the halachic issues discussed here and the issues discussed here are going to relieve the pain of many millions of people who need this halachic guidance to light the way in the tragedies in their lives. And I think that this has been a tremendous contribution. So I would just want to thank Rabbi Dr. Weiss and Dr. Furman for your contribution to the lives of so many people.